This is Creating a Family. Talk about foster, adoptive, and kinship care. Welcome back to our regular listeners. We are so happy that you have been a part of our journey all along, and it is because of you that we are where we're at now, and we really do appreciate it. But also a shout out to our new listeners. You're going to help us get to where we want to go, and we also are appreciative of you. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show and the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about intergenerational trauma. And make sure you stay around to the end because we're going to be giving you practical tips on how to heal from intergenerational trauma. We will be talking with Beth Tyson. She is a childhood trauma consultant, a 3 times best-selling author, a CASA volunteer, and the Pennsylvania Child Abuse Prevention Team co-chair. Before becoming a consultant and a facilitator, Beth was a family-based trauma therapist who helped stabilize mental health crises in foster, adoption, and kinship homes. Welcome, Beth, to Creating a Family.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here with all of you.
So most of us have an idea what trauma is, and we've even begun to grasp the idea that trauma comes in many different forms and doesn't have to result in a broken bone or rape or something that is outwardly dramatic. But here we're talking about intergenerational trauma, and that feels like something different altogether. So what is intergenerational trauma?
Sure. It's a great question. And it was a term that when I learned about kind of blew my mind. I was like, wow, wait a minute. This is fascinating to learn about. But basically what it is trauma that can be passed down through generations. So things that have happened in the past leave markers, chemical markers on our biology, and epigenetic changes take place in our bodies, and that can be passed down to our offspring. And research from Dr. Rachel Yehuda in 2018 backed up this finding, and it was just, it's groundbreaking.
And we're going to go more into what we mean by epigenetic changes in just a bit. Are there some other names that people may have heard intergenerational trauma called?
Oh, yes. So some people call it transgenerational trauma. Others call it historical trauma, collective trauma, ancestral trauma. Have I missed any? I think there's a handful of them.
Yeah, there are generational trauma, which is
generational, right? Yes.
It goes by a lot of different names that we might hear.
Yep.
So what type of events can cause intergenerational trauma?
Sure. It can be anything from large-scale natural disasters that happen throughout history to political strife, to racism and oppression, to family dynamics that were traumatic for children and families and family members. So it really kind of runs the gamut. There's all different types of situations that can create this epigenetic change in our bodies. And so, there's a wide variety of events and circumstances.
Would it include being raised in an abusive home or by an alcoholic parent or a parent who struggled with mental health issues or things
Absolutely.
that are that mundane? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. And so it's passed down not only through this thing called epigenetics, but it's also passed down behaviorally. So we're picking up on different behaviors and stories and narratives from our ancestors that get passed down through families and learned behavior. So it's kind of both a behavioral and a biological change.
Okay, so we'll separate those two. You have mentioned epigenetics, so let's dive into that. So let's talk about what we mean by the possible role that epigenetic changes could have, whereas something could happen historically to a member, let's say our grandmother, and yet it is actually biologically affecting the generation, her grandchildren's generation. So what do we mean by that, epigenetic changes?
Yeah, so basically it's complex and we're not even fully sure how exactly it happens scientifically. Much more research is needed in this area. But what we do know is that it's not necessarily a genetic inheritance, but it's an epigenetic inheritance, which means that there are changes that happen and markers that are placed on our DNA that can be expressed in future generations. So it's an expression of the gene in a different way than if the trauma had not happened. It's almost like a triggering event that makes a mark on our biology that then plays out in our genes and in our relationships and in our family roles and on and on and on.
As I've understood it, it's that it can affect it in a couple of ways. And tell me if this is correct, that it can change the way your body reads we all have DNA, and it's not changing the fundamentals of the DNA, but
Right.
it changes the way the body reads the DNA. Or some people think that it activates dormant genes, that a gene that was dormant now becomes active because of these changes.
Right, right. Which is why we see mental health issues tend to run in families. So there's a connection between depression and intergenerational trauma and anxiety and intergenerational trauma. And we think that maybe what is happening is the trauma is leaving this marker on our genes to either turn on or turn off certain gene expressions that then result in mental health problems that maybe wouldn't have taken place if the historical trauma hadn't been there.
Mm-hmm. Genes that prime us for things like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, those responses can be activated in different ways that would help us in future generations, in a good way, help them avoid dangerous situations.
Right.
But if it was a traumatic event that overactivated the fight, flight, or freeze, that can also then in future generations impact their abilities because of the changes in our genetics, the changes that happened generations before us.
Right. So we're all here today on this planet because our ancestors had that system. They developed that ability to recognize danger and threat and remove themselves, fight for themselves, or freeze to protect themselves, or even appease other tribes and other members of their community to not be a threat. So those trauma responses are there for a reason. We developed them for a reason. They protect us. They're survival mechanisms. However, when there's extreme adversity, especially in early life, we can become stuck in these responses. Our brain kind of gets a little bit stuck, our body feels stuck in a trauma response or is easily activated into a trauma response from just even innocuous things in our environment. And so that's, initially a survival mechanism that we all needed in order to be here today, but it can get set into overdrive where it's almost like an overprotective system. And that's when it becomes problematic for everyday life and functioning.
It seems like it would be hard to tease out. You mentioned inherited behavioral responses from epigenetic responses. It seems like the two have got to be tied, because I could certainly see how behavior, if I had been raised in an alcoholic environment by a parent that was an alcoholic, and so I learned to avoid conflict, then in my parenting, I might be avoiding conflict and then training my children to avoid conflict. That's a behavior that's passed down, whether or not it actually impacted my genes in any way. Is that how you see it as well?
Yes, it is hard to discern. It's hard to tease those two things out, right? And so it becomes complicated when it all, plays out. But yes, that both of those things can happen simultaneously or independent from one another.
Let me pause here to remind you that we want your questions. Please send us any questions you have in the area of being a foster parent, an adoptive parent, or a kinship parent. And we answer these questions on our Weekend Wisdom podcast. We've been getting some really good questions. Some of them are challenging and they require a lot of thought on our part to answer, and some are just fun. So send me your questions. You can send them to info@creatingafamily.org, and we really appreciate them, and they make Weekend Wisdom a whole lot more fun. And now let's get back to the interview with Beth. How do we recognize behavior that is triggering intergenerational trauma?
So typically, triggers come from our environment, our sensory systems, and our ability to seek out or to fend off threats. And so when we are triggered, or I like to use the word activated into a trauma response, we are usually picking up information either internally in our bodies, like certain feelings that we're feeling internally, or something externally, like a smell, a sound, a touch, and those five senses. So when we are activated into a trauma response, it's because of some information that's coming into our brain and our nervous system that says danger, danger, danger. Something here reminds me of a previous harm or something dangerous. And so it sets off all the chemical reactions in our body to protect ourselves, to run, to fight, or if there's no option to run or fight, then we'll often freeze. And that is when you see people take more of a dissociative or sort of a checked out, zoned out,
Mm-hmm.
almost like very low hypoarousal in
Mm-hmm.
order to protect themselves. And we see this in animals too. A lot of the trauma experts and specialists have shared stories on other podcasts about how animals actually, when they are feeling under threat or in danger, they go through a process where they freeze if they think they're going to be eaten. And then as they're coming out of the freeze response, they shake. Their whole bodies shake and quiver. And there's some science to suggest that that shaking and quivering acts as a mitigator for the trauma that the animal has just experienced so that they don't actually go on to have the PTSD type struggles that humans have. And so, that's why one of the biggest interventions of our decade is the somatic interventions, where people are really doing body work and are doing things to help them sort of work out and process the trauma out of their bodies instead of holding it all in and holding on to it in their nervous system.
And as far as being able to determine whether we are being activated by intergenerational trauma or trauma that happened to us, is it important that we know the distinction? We as parents or caregivers, how do we know whether, okay, is this something that I'm reacting to because of something that's happened to me? Or is this something that I have brought down through the generations and is causing me to react in this way that, let's assume it's not a positive way to react?
Right. Well, I think it's really healing, and it is part of the process of healing the intergenerational trauma is to become a detective about your past and become curious about your ancestors and what they endured. If you can't talk directly with them and get actual stories from their lives, you can look into history and say, okay, what are some of the big events that my grandparents lived through? Were they in the Holocaust? Were they in a war? Were they involved in some sort of natural disaster? Were they in a pandemic, like all of us,
Mm-hmm.
which is leaving enormous amounts of trauma and loss and grief that's unresolved on children and adults. So looking back through time, if you don't have access to those actual ancestors and trying to figure out what they went through, because we are all holding it right now. Most generations before us weren't aware of trauma and how it impacts our brain and our bodies. This is new, I think, for, in the last, 30 years, maybe. And so we're the first ones who are actually recognizing it and trying to address it and like really let go of it. And we're just holding an enormous amount of weight and despair from the past. Now, you asked the question, like, does it matter if you can recognize that it's intergenerational or not? I think it does matter. For me, for example, really was healing for me. I've struggled with my own anxiety and panic attacks throughout my life, and I really couldn't figure out where they were coming from. And that caused me a lot of distress because I would blame myself and I would feel very shameful about it, like I was a weak person, there must be something wrong with me, I'm ill, all of these labels that we put on ourselves. And the more I learned about my family history and the more I learned about my early childhood, I was like, oh, wait a minute. I've been through some things and my ancestors have been through some things. And although I don't come from, like looking at me, you might think I'm, just a white American that doesn't really have any history of oppression. But it turns out that my grandmother was an orphan and was adopted into a Catholic family, but she was actually Jewish. And so her mother died during the Great Depression when my grandmother was in her teens, we think, like maybe 13-ish, the middle of the Great Depression. And her father couldn't care for her and her siblings. So they were sent to a girls' home. And so she was an orphan. And so we don't have a lot of information about her family. And when I thought about that level of trauma for her, it all started to make sense why I might have a little anxiety in my system. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, wow, I don't have to carry all the blame for this pain that I'm feeling. And And that was very liberating for myself. And I think it can be liberating for others as well. And then you have people from historically oppressed communities, our BIPOC communities, LGBTQ plus communities who have faced oppression and racism and bigotry and all of the things. And that is also passed down. So recognizing what we're holding and the levels of pain and despair that are in our nervous systems, I think can help us have respect for ourselves instead of shame, and to look back and say, wow, my lineage endured all that and I'm still here. I think that gives me power.
Approaching ourselves with grace and compassion
Yeah.
for our struggles. And I think the good news is that these behavioral changes and even the epigenetic changes, as I understand it, they can be reversed. And thus, it's possible for us to not pass on to the next generation the trauma that our ancestors and ourselves have carried.
Yeah, absolutely. So some of your listeners may have heard of the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. But if you haven't, I encourage you to look it up. There's lots of good information out there on the ACEs study. And that studied what adversity does to young children and how it plays out over the lifespan. But recently, there's new research on the PCEs, the positive childhood experiences, and how they buffer and mitigate the impacts of early life trauma. And so there's both these adverse experiences we can have, but then there's these protective experiences that we can have that we can then pass down to our offspring. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is hope, and we do have neuroplasticity in our brains until the end of life. Although it does weaken over time, we do have the ability to change and to grow and develop and learn new ways of relating to one another and to learn how to have safe and secure, trusting relationships. But that has to happen most often in relation with safe others. So if you're not able to find safety and you don't have support around you, it's going to be really difficult to overcome this intergenerational trauma, as well as any type of present psychological trauma that's taking place in your life.
And so many of us are raising children who have experienced their own trauma. And it's so important for us to look inward and say, what are we bringing to the equation? And that can be our own trauma.
Yeah.
And what's a fascinating aspect of this discussion is that we could also be bringing to the table traumas that our ancestors have had and their responses, as well as their epigenetic changes, their epigenetics, are influencing how we respond to the children that we are raising who have their own trauma. So, but they're the kids, and we can't expect for them to make these changes. It's incumbent upon us. That's our role as their parents and caregivers.
Yeah, and I think it's a heavy responsibility. But if you have the knowledge and you have the wherewithal and the support to be able to make these changes in your own behavior, it's unprecedented the progress that you can make. And of course, not everything can be healed. And then there's people too, as I was preparing for this conversation, I had a talk with a colleague who feels that, putting the weight of historical trauma on an individual to heal and sort of be the cycle breaker of that trauma is too much to expect from one person, right? We didn't know what we were coming into, right? As humans, we can't put all the responsibility on the individuals to heal this and break these patterns. We need community support. We need collective care. We need systems change and recognition for the harms and the suffering that we've caused one another. And so it can't just be an individual thing that we take on ourselves. I personally believe that we have to do it together.
Mm-hmm. I am such a believer in the power of support and peer support in particular, well, professional support as well, obviously, but peer support can go a long way. Let me interrupt to let you know about a prenatal substance exposure workshop that is being offered by Creating a Family. You can get more information about it at bit.ly/prenatal exposure-training. We are offering it a couple of times a year, and you can check it out. It is a 4.5 hour, it's 3 sessions, and we cover different ages, we cover practical tips, we cover explanation. It is a terrific resource. Again, you can get it at bit.ly/prenatal-exposure-training. So now let's move to talking about how do we heal from this type of trauma. And it seems like the first step is recognizing that this could be part of what's at play. Even recognizing that it exists seems like the very first step.
Yeah. I think we're having a hard time even getting people to realize that they themselves have trauma in their own lifetime. And now we're asking them to acknowledge trauma, from generations past. And it's like, oh man, this can just seem like an avalanche, right? Just a cascade of trauma that we can't sort of ever get out from under. But the research shows that change can take place in a generation. And that's the hopeful part. And so one of the ways to help recognize it, other than, researching your history and things like that, is to notice what brings up big emotions in you that your children or child does. So say you have a child who has trouble with crying too much. This is a common problem that I had. So my daughter, they cry, babies cry, toddlers cry, young children cry. And for me, it was a visceral, like lightning bolt of anxiety that would go through me every time she cried. And I knew that something major was there, right? Like I knew that something beyond what was normal or typical for a mom to feel was kind of happening in me. And so I had to ask myself, what is this hitting on in me? What need was not met for me as a child that's bringing out this strong reaction for me? What need was not met for my ancestors that is coming out in me now and is being expressed in me now? And so one of the ways that I sort of find clarity in the moment when I'm feeling really frustrated with a child or with my own child is to ask myself, like, why is this behavior bringing out such a strong emotion in me? What's underneath this? Because the child is just being a child. They're doing childlike things, they're frustrating, they're asserting their independence, they're being hyper or unable to settle their nervous systems, and they need our help. And if we are dysregulated and we're all fired up, it's going to be really difficult to help that child to find their way back to equilibrium. And so we need to be aware of sort of what activations are we experiencing from the children in our care, and then how do we find a moment to just breathe and maybe splash some cold water on our face, or maybe walk into the other room and shut the door for a minute if it's safe, just so we can kind of get grounded and then say, okay, this isn't about the child, this is something in me, this is something that's hitting a nerve in my past, and then move forward responding to the child from that place instead of, oh my God, this kid is driving me nuts.
Yeah. Well, we often say this kid is pushing my buttons, but
Yes.
I often think, yes, but it probably helps us to recognize which of our buttons are a little raised, which of our buttons stand out, which of our buttons are we wearing on our shoulders so it's really easy to press, and why are we wearing those buttons in the forefront? Yeah, it's hard to look at ourselves because honestly, it's easier to focus on the kids and say, this kid's a lot, or this kid, hopefully we're not saying this kid's bad, but this is just a rotten kid. We hope we're not doing that, but this kid's a lot. And we often do that with kids that we're raising because they have experienced a lot. And sometimes they do have big behaviors.
Yep.
But how do we respond to those, and which ones get under our skin the most?
Yes, exactly. And, we're not going to get it right every time. I certainly don't. I still have moments where I can't stay calm and I, lose my patience. And I think that we put so much pressure on ourselves sometimes to be perfect as caregivers. We're so fearful of hurting or harming our children that we're so tightly wound. It's like we got to give ourselves some grace too, that if we were perfect parents, that also wouldn't be great for our child either, because they would have no example of what it means to make mistakes and pick themselves back up again and move forward. So although we want to try and, limit the really harmful stuff, we are going to make mistakes as parents, and they're learning something valuable from that too.
Yeah. Yeah, that humans make mistakes, and how we
Yeah.
repair mistakes is hugely valuable. So, another tip would be, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that when we make mistakes, which we're going to do, ask for forgiveness, admit your mistakes, try to repair any damage that you may have caused. And honestly, just acknowledging that this wasn't my finest hour. I was doing the best I could, but it wasn't very good, and I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That is huge. You took the words right out of my mouth. You hit it right on the head. Yeah. I mean, again, that was not something that was done in generations past. It was seen as, oh my gosh, you don't apologize to a child. That shows them that you were wrong and they can't ever think that we do anything wrong. We got to keep our power here. But that is actually not what is best for a child's emotional development. They need to hear apologies. They deserve apologies. And it repairs the relationship because we're always going to have those ruptures, right? We're always going to have something that goes wrong between us. We're humans. But if we can circle back and say, hey, I really messed up. I
Mm-hmm.
really am not proud of the way I acted yesterday. And I want you to know that I'm sorry and I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to do better next time.
Mm-hmm.
And then making the effort to do better next time, whether it's getting into your own therapy, whether it's, reading and learning different coping skills and different parenting skills to help you improve. But we actually have to not just say the words, but put the effort behind it as well.
You talked about positive childhood experiences. Can providing positive childhood experiences help heal some of the trauma caused intergenerationally?
Yes. So the research shows that, it's not like one for one. It's not like if you have this one trauma and this one protective thing, then they cancel out and your child no longer has trauma, right? It's not like that black and white. I just like to
Mhm.
say that to be clear so there's no misunderstanding.
Good point.
Yeah. But what the research shows is that even for children with three or more ACEs, when they have three or more protective or positive childhood experiences, there's much more significant less risk for the long-term negative mental health outcomes. I'll say that again because it kind of got choppy, but even if a child has several ACEs, if they also have several positive childhood experiences, it reduces the risks for negative long-term mental health outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest positives is having one caring adult in their lives. So, if nothing else, if you are that one caring adult who is committed to this child and is going to hang in there with this child, that's a huge positive.
Oh, yeah. Children need to be claimed, as my
Yeah.
friend and colleague Allison Maxon says. She wrote the book, Seven Core Issues in Adoption,
Mm-hmm.
and she just has a new workbook out too. And she always used that phrase when I was working with her on a PowerPoint presentation last year. And she said, children need to be claimed. They need to feel like they belong somewhere, that they have a committed person in their life, even if it's just one person that claims them. They need to know that they belong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very powerful thing. And in fact, all of the PCEs, you can look them up. If you just Google positive childhood experiences, it'll come right up. If you look at them, they all have something in common. And what they have in common is connection.
Mm-hmm.
So the more connection, the more support, the more friends, family, neighbors, coaches, teachers, the more people in a child's life that care for them, who are
Mm-hmm.
committed and consistently showing up for them, the better the long-term outcomes for their mental health.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Give us an example of a couple of the positive childhood experiences that we are seeking for our children.
Yeah. So one that I find interesting is at least two people outside the home who are supportive. So adds to the potential long-term positive outcomes. Others are belonging in the community. So like having traditions and rituals within the community, whether it's like attending a church service or a synagogue or some type of other religious community event, or whether it's belonging to some other type of group. So that always helps. Having someone at home they feel they can tell the truth to, someone that hears them, someone they can turn to with their problems. And a couple of other ones, I'm trying to think off the top of my head what the other ones were, but they're kind of all in that same thread of like having someone.
Feeling stood by during difficult times.
Yes, thank you. I don't have it right in front of
I'm just
me.
trying to, yeah, I'm not, I'm just
There's
kind of,
7, so.
yeah, friends, obviously you mentioned that.
Mhm,
Yeah, being able to talk about your feelings, both the positive and the negative, with
mhm.
somebody in your family.
Yep.
Yeah, all of those. And I can't help but add in community traditions, tribal traditions, cultural traditions are
Yes.
also just so important for humans in general, but especially for children.
Yeah. And we've
Mhm.
lost a lot of that, the rituals. And rituals bond people together. They create a sense of structure and things that children can expect and look forward to. So, including rituals of any kind, whether it's religious, cultural, even just for fun, something that's in your
Yeah.
family that you like to
Well,
do.
your family ritual, yeah.
Right.
Every Tuesday is Taco Tuesday, and we get
Hmm.
ice cream that night. Once a month, we have family movie night, and we rotate who chooses the movie. Things like that. It doesn't have to be particularly grand or expensive.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And then another way to sort of help heal for children that have experienced trauma is finding ways to connect them back to their history. If they can't be in relationship with immediate family members for safety reasons or just because of abandonment or death or whatever the reason might be, finding any type of connection to their history, their cultural history, their religious history, their family history is going to help them feel grounded and move them through the healing process faster if they have these connections. So it's not only about the people. Children in foster care and in adoptive or kinship homes, they lose their people, they lose their connections. And yes, we want to put as many of those connections around them as we can. But if for some reason we can't, we can also connect them to their history. So maybe it's finding out something about their family through research. Maybe it's visiting a place that was important to the child or the family. Maybe it's making a certain food or dessert that was really important to the child or their family, so that they can hold on to something of their identity and say, this is where I came from. And these are the type of people I was from.
Hmm.
Because even if they've learned that their immediate family members can't be trusted, there's somebody in that family line that was good. I believe that.
Hmm.
There's goodness in everyone, regardless of what happens. But what I mean is like, just because they may not have had parents that were able to step up and do the right thing, probably because of their own trauma, there's other people and role models to look to within their family tree.
Hmm.
So always encourage that as well.
Some of the talk now, a lot of the talk now in the professional community is on resiliency. Would some of the things that we encourage, some of which we've already mentioned, but as there are additional ones, to help our kids be resilient, is resiliency or encouraging resiliency, building resiliency, is that another way to heal from intergenerational trauma?
The tricky word, right? It's really
Hmm.
popular right now.
Sure
I have
is.
mixed feelings about it myself, but I've found a definition from Dr. Bruce Perry, who's one of my favorite trauma experts and who I've learned a lot from. He says resiliency is formed through moderate and predictable stressors. And so anything that is moderate and predictable. Now, trauma falls outside of that window of moderate and predictable, right? Things that are traumatic are usually extreme on the severe side, or they are very unpredictable, very unexpected, surprise, shocking things, right? But things like sports, he uses as an example. So playing a sport is moderate and predictable stress. The child has to sort of put themselves out there, and there's pressure on them to perform, and there's expectations, and there's things to learn and grow from. But it's predictable in that it happens every week at the same time, and they know when practice is, and they know when the games are, and it's all scheduled out, and it's planned. And so that type of stress is called eustress for most people. And that's a good type of stress that helps fortify us and strengthen us against the adversity in life. But anything that falls out of the side of that moderate and predictable type of stress is not building resilience. And so that's why, it's nuanced. It's not quite straightforward as people think. And then children aren't necessarily born with resiliency. They have to learn it through these experiences of overcoming and overcoming and overcoming,
Hmm.
these moderate stressors.
I think some temperaments, I've seen discussion on this, but I've also seen it personally. Some temperaments are just fairly resilient. I mean, I think there is something inborn about some people. They just seem to be able to bounce back, but that's not something that we can control. That is something that is inborn. But others of us who perhaps temperamentally are not as resilient can also build our resilience. The well of our resilience may not be quite as deep, but we can certainly learn to plumb that depth, whatever it is.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think resilience is dependent on the circumstances around the child's life. So if there may be a child who's more resilient, is it because they have more support? Is it because they don't have a history of, any type of trauma? Is it because they don't have a lot of trauma in their ancestry?
Mm-hmm.
What is it that's leading this child to be more of a dandelion than an orchid?
Yeah, yeah.
I like
Great
that.
book. I did too.
Yeah, I like that.
That was a book, by the way. I
Yeah.
think it's called Dandelion and Orchids. I think we've interviewed the author of that book.
Great. Yeah, I like that because you're right. It does seem like some are, a little more hardy than others. And I think what's happened around the child can make them more resilient or not. Has this
Mm-hmm.
child battled some sort of relational trauma already? Have they had medical illnesses or emergencies in their young life? What is it that's taken place that's made it harder for this child to cope with everyday stressors? On top of, whatever sort of temperament they might have been born with.
This show, as well as all the resources provided by Creating a Family, probably wouldn't happen without the support of the Jockey Being Family Foundation. It's through their support that we have been able to bring you our free courses. There are 1-hour courses. They are self-paced. You take them on your own. They come with a certificate of completion if you need that, and you can get them at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. And now back to the show. So we've talked about things that one can do which take time. Recognize that intergenerational trauma is real. Become a detective of your own background, trying to understand what has happened. Focus inward. Why are we so activated by this particular behavior? Claiming our children, things such as that. But in the heat of the moment, when we are being triggered, when our kid is driving us crazy, perhaps that's not exactly the time to say, well, I wonder if I'm reacting this way because my mother's mother was very distant and never showed any warmth and didn't ever hug her. Not probably the most effective use of our time right then when we're really seeing red because of our kids' behavior. So any thoughts on what we could do as the stopgap? Okay, I just got to deal with this right now. Yeah. I'll go back and be that detective. I'll go back and do all this. But right now, just help me because I'm going bananas with this kid.
Yeah.
Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is preemptive that we have to do, right? A lot of the work that we need to do is preventative. So we need to be working on ourselves and our own stuff so that we don't get to that boiling point so quickly with the child.
Mm-hmm.
So it is long-term work. There aren't any really quick fixes, especially when it comes to raising children with trauma. But I do think that there are coping strategies in the moment that we can use, one of them being that sort of taking a break and knowing that it's okay as long as the child is safe to step away for a moment and kind of gather ourselves. Cold water can be a very fast way to send some signals of safety to your nervous system. So that might be drinking a glass of ice water or running your hands under cold water or even splashing your face with cold water, doing some of those somatic exercises that I talked about earlier. So maybe, you take a minute and you do some bilateral stimulation. And if you haven't learned what that is, I encourage you to look that one up too. Maybe we can put some links in the notes. And really recognizing that children typically have an arc for their, meltdowns or tantrums or emotional outbursts, trauma responses, whatever we want to call them, that they typically do have sort of a beginning and a middle and an end. And children with trauma will have a longer arc, but it does usually start to settle down, somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour. And so part of just knowing that this is going to end and having some mantras as you're going through the process, one that I learned from Dr. Becky, if you know who she is my child is a good child having a hard time. I am a good parent having a hard time. So like it's just kind of centering yourself and like we're not battling against each other. Like we're both having a hard time and we're going to get through this, and reminders of like, okay, I just have to let them sort of feel this out. Now, for me, I really struggled with this, especially when my child was younger and would have a lot of meltdowns or tantrums. But I had to give up trying to stop it. You know, it's like the more we try to stop it, like the harder it gets. And so I had to accept that there was nothing wrong with her crying or getting upset as long as she was safe. And so I stopped trying to stop it. I realized that she really needed to let it out. Like some kids have valid rage that they just need to express with these big emotions and the tears and the crying. And so I started getting comfortable with just allowing it, being present, being there. And I'm not saying like let them cry it out for hours and hours and hours, but I mean if they're in a tantrum for 20 or 30 or 40 minutes, it seems like hours and hours and hours, but I would remind myself like this will end. I'll stay here, remind them that she is safe, remind myself that this is going to pass, and kind of really keep my eye on the fact that this isn't the end of the world. This is what children do. They have to express it. And I started to notice that the more I let her cry, instead of trying to soothe right away and distract her with things, that she would be like much calmer throughout the rest of the day because she had gotten out all these big emotions. And so, yeah, sometimes kids just have to cry.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and we need to be their soft place to land and to sort of hold all those tears. And so those are some things that have helped me sort of in the moment to reframe what's going on and also to try and like calm my nervous system.
So, how do we deal with the guilt that we potentially passed on our trauma to our child, and now the child you are raising is suffering as a result? And we see this particularly can happen in families, but we do see this in kinship families where grandparents in particular are raising their grandchild, and they realize that some of what they did as parents, sometimes there is no contribution. It's just that their child is struggling very often with substance abuse disorder, and that happens regardless of what type of parenting you did. But other times you can say, if you look back, you can recognize that there were things that I did that resulted in my child not being as good a parent as I had hoped that they would be. And now I am raising my grandchild, and this grandchild is suffering as a result. That's a really hard thing. Sometimes it's unfair to dump that on ourselves, but sometimes it is fair. So thoughts on how to deal with that?
Yeah, that's really hard. And there is, I'm sure, a tremendous amount of guilt that comes along with kinship families. I've worked specifically with kinship families. They were about half of my caseload when I was working in homes. Tremendous amount of guilt there, and oftentimes an inability even to recognize that they may have caused any harm to their children
Mm-hmm.
or overlooked harm that was happening to their child, you know. So
Sure.
I saw that more often, but as we're becoming more sort of knowledgeable about trauma and how it's become more of the conversation just in the last few years because of the pandemic, I think people are probably starting to feel the weight of that guilt. And I heard a term recently called presentism. Presentism. Have you heard of this before?
I haven't, but I like it.
Yeah.
If it's what I think it is, I like it. Go ahead and tell me what it is.
So my understanding, and I don't know a whole lot about it, but presentism is when we sort of take for granted what we know now, and we sort of forget that in the past we didn't know this information, and that wasn't our fault.
Yes.
You know, it just was the times that we were living in, and we were probably surviving in survival mode and didn't even have the bandwidth to learn about mental health or psychology or any of that. And so there's this presentism that can come in between generations where the generation of today is saying, well, I'm so hurt by how my parents raised me, and they should have known better and they should have done the work and they blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, you're basing that off of what we know today in
Right.
2024. You're not basing that off of what
Yes.
they knew in 1974.
Right. Or the cultural norms that are in
Right.
2024 that were not there. My father was never around. He worked till 8 o'clock every night. Don't mean me personally, but I mean that you could say, well, my dad was never around. He was a totally absent father. And that may well be the case. But if you talked with the father may have said, yeah, I wished I had been more around. But back then when I was doing that, that was what was considered being a good father.
Yes.
Was making sure that I would get raises, that I would be promoted. Or we moved all the time. Well, yes, we moved all the time because that's what I thought I was supposed to be doing. I was going to get paid more. I was going to. So it's taking what the expectations are now and applying them to the past.
Exactly. You nailed it.
Yeah, that makes
You hit
sense.
it. Yep. And that really was helpful for me in my own sort of healing, because I think when we look back, we're all going to have, even my child is going to look back and wish that I had done things differently, right? I look back and wish my parents had done things differently. I'm sure they look back and wish their parents had, but we have to put that lens on first before we look back and say, wait a minute, what did they know back then? What were the norms back then? What were the stressors back then? What was it like to live back then? We don't really know because we weren't there.
The kinship parents may have been, these grandparents may have been back there, but there's also a certain amount of saying, if you can say, I did the best I could with where I was at and the support I had, that's helpful too, to be able to say that. And then sometimes acknowledging that I wasn't the best, but I have grown and I have learned. And if I had it to do over again, I would do things differently. But this is my do-over now. I am raising these children now. This is the do-over. So all I can do is do the best I can with these kids.
Yes, exactly. And that is the honest truth.
Yeah.
We can't go back in time and we can't redo that, but we can make different choices now. And that's that old saying, know better, do better, from Maya Angelou, who I love. And that's not the whole quote, but when we know better, we do better. And that's our responsibility. So I encourage anyone who is struggling with that, not to just leave it with that you recognize it, but go back and try to repair some of that. It's never too late. It's never too late. I don't think if anyone came to me at any age and said, hey, I didn't do things the best I could have done them 30 years ago. I'm sorry. That would have a profound and lasting effect on me. So, maybe where you can, if possible, try to make those conversations and those repairs happen. Yeah.
Also, know you're not alone, because there is no single parent, none, that hasn't made mistakes. It's just part of being human. It's part of raising children, so you aren't alone in having made mistakes, and maybe that will help.
I think that's where the peer support can be really helpful for kinship families. I've had the pleasure of working with several different support groups for kinship families, and they find a lot of help from each other. And just that me too feeling of yes, I've been in your shoes too, and I feel how you felt, and maybe here's some things that helped me, or just to know you're not alone is incredibly powerful.
Let me throw out that creating a family, we have some in-person kinship support groups, but we also have an online kinship support group. So if you are looking for support, peer support, please reach out to us at info@creatingafamily.org. Thank you so much, Beth Tyson, for being with us today to talk about intergenerational trauma. In addition to being a consultant for childhood trauma, Beth is also the author of 2 children's books for grandfamilies or for kinship caregivers. One is A Grand Family for Sullivan, and the second one is Sullivan Goes to See Mama. Ask your independent bookstore to buy them, or of course you can buy them on Amazon. We will be listing them on our suggested books page, so you can find them there at creatingafamily.org, hovering over the word kinship and clicking on suggested books, and you can find them there. Thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to share this time with you, and I hope it was helpful for your audience.